At 1408 local time, 26 miles south of Kharg Island, a Navy Seahawk levels off at 50 feet and pushes north, closing on a tanker for the first intercept of the reimposed American naval blockade. On the schedule, it reads like a formality. Radio her, warn her, hold her. Nobody strapped into that cockpit knows that out on Kharg, an air defense crew has kept a Chinese-built battery alive through 90 American airstrikes by doing one thing: never turning it on. Today, they finally have a target worth breaking the silence for. But the helicopter doesn't see the missile coming. It sees tracer rounds first, walking through the exact patch of sky the aircraft occupied 2 seconds earlier. The pilot horses the Seahawk into a hard right turn, bleeding altitude down to 30 feet as the airframe shudders through the bank. The fire is falling from above, off the top deck of a wellhead platform that hasn't pumped oil since the Carter administration. Rust bleeding down every leg, a windsock rotted to ribbons, and mounted on the rail, a twin-barrel 23mm gun, old enough that the man cranking it by hand is doing so in sandals. That gun gives off no electronic signature at all, so the Seahawk's threat receivers stay silent. They're built to catch a shout, and an unpowered mechanical mount doesn't shout. 12 days that gunner has sat up there with nothing but a thermos and patience, and the geometry today is backward from anything the manual prepared him for. His gun deck sits 100 feet above the water on 4 corroded legs, so instead of craning upward at a fast crossing target, the way every anti-aircraft gunner since the First World War has trained to do, he's looking down a gentle slope at a helicopter silhouetted flat against bright water with nowhere to hide. He leads it by a full aircraft length, the way somebody once taught him, and walks his burst straight into the empty air where the Seahawk should have been a heartbeat later. Ducking behind cover stops working the moment your enemy is standing above the cover. And climbing is exactly the option this crew doesn't have, because an Iranian search radar out of Bushehr is sweeping the sky over their heads every few seconds. And further up the coastline sits an S-300 variant that owns every inch of airspace above roughly 100 feet, with interceptors leaving the rail at 6 times the speed of sound. From the moment that system detects a launch opportunity, a helicopter has about 45 seconds to react, and 45 seconds of full climb buys a Seahawk somewhere around 1,200 feet of altitude. That's a foot race against a missile, and the missile has the better afternoon ahead of it. What that missile system cannot do, though, is follow the curve of the Earth. Its guidance beam travels in a straight line while the ocean's surface drops away beneath it, which means an aircraft that stays low in the wave clutter is effectively hiding behind a hill made of seawater. 50 feet isn't a tactic today, it's the only option there is. Under normal circumstances, a growler would already be on station, ready to introduce that surface battery to an anti-radiation missile. Not this afternoon. Every electronic warfare aircraft in the region is 400 miles southeast, busy turning another Iranian missile complex into rubble. So the Navy's entire response to Iranian air defense in this pocket of the Gulf is a single helicopter crew flying like they stole the aircraft. The pilot brakes sideways instead of climbing, 30 feet and accelerating, and the tracer stream falls behind and stops. The gun problem is solved. The man standing behind that gunner with a tube braced on his shoulder is not solved. A launch flash lights the platform's upper deck, and flares punch out of the Seahawk's dispenser in a spreading arc, burning hot white against the sky. The missile ignores every single one. It should work. It doesn't, because this is a newer shoulder-fired weapon with a dual-band seeker, reading heat in 2 separate wavelengths simultaneously and discarding anything that burns bright in one band and dim in the other, which is exactly the signature a magnesium flare produces. Picture a bouncer checking 2 forms of ID under 2 different lights. The fake always looks wrong under the second one. The Seahawk's exhaust suppressors are doing their job, folding cool rotor wash into the engine's exhaust plume before it ever leaves the airframe. And most days, that trick is the whole ballgame. But an aircraft's heat signature isn't one single point, and this seeker doesn't need the whole picture, just enough of it. The missile burns past wide of the tail, close enough that the door gunner tracks it visibly, and detonates harmlessly over open water. Nobody aboard ever sees who fired it. They never do. $20,000 of hardware and one man's climb up a ladder against a Navy paycheck that just spent one reload and left a scorch mark on the helicopter deck to show for it. Iran's air defense budget hard at work protecting an empty patch of ocean. Here's the part the crew has no way of knowing yet. 6 miles behind them, on a platform they overflew 4 minutes earlier, 2 men are still standing on a catwalk with binoculars and a handheld radio charged off a solar panel zip-tied to the railing. That platform draws 0 watts of electronic emission, which makes it invisible to every American sensor in the Gulf and not worth wasting a warhead on. They don't need sensors. They read the tail number of the Seahawk's boom as it passed overhead and radioed it in. And that call is the second half of a tracking chain whose first half sits 60 miles inland along the coast. An early warning radar network stretched out like a fence line, operating at the extreme low end of the VHF band on wavelengths roughly 33 feet long. Wavelengths that size reflect hardest of objects close to their own size, and a Seahawk's rotor disc spans 54 feet. It rings like a bell on that radar screen. What that radar can't do is pinpoint. Its picture smears into a box of uncertainty 17 miles wide. It's held this helicopter somewhere inside that box since the moment it lifted off. 11 minutes into the intercept now. Fuel that should have gone toward the mission burned dodging a rust heap of a platform, and the tanker still sits 8.5 miles from the territorial water where American forces can't legally lay a hand on her. The clock that actually matters to this crew isn't on any instrument panel. It's the shrinking gap between the tanker's bow and that 12-mile line, drawn right across the surface of the sea. The Seahawk crabs sideways to pull alongside her, and she fills the windscreen, a wall of red and black hull riding high and nearly empty, barely making way. Her wake lies flat, no white water churning behind her, 5.5 knots against a logged average closer to 10. Nothing's wrong with her engines. She's timing her arrival. 12 decks up, her master isn't panicking, he's running a schedule. Shadow Fleet voyages survive because a warship hails you, logs you, and lets you continue. The paperwork is the entire punishment, and the cargo still gets delivered. He's made this exact run 4 times since spring. What he hasn't quite registered is that the voice on Channel 16 stopped repeating itself 9 minutes ago. Her transponder claims she's bound for a commercial port up the Iraqi coast. Every merchant vessel broadcasts an automatic identification signal, and the destination field inside it gets typed in by hand, by whoever happens to be on watch. Her actual heading points at Kharg Island and the loading jetties on its eastern shore. One number aboard this ship, though, can't be repainted or retyped, an International Maritime Organization number, stamped permanently into her hull, that survives no matter how many times the rest of her identity changes. That number ties this vessel through 4 previous names and 6 different flags. A floating burner phone the size of an office tower, swapping its SIM card every voyage. All of it is paper, and paper holds up right until a Navy crew looks through a pair of binoculars and reads the number for themselves. Running an American blockade in the largest ship class on the water is a little like shoplifting from a warehouse store on a parade float. Eventually, somebody at the exit checks the receipt. The co-pilot works Channel 16, then 13, then 6, and gets nothing back but static on all 3. The bridge wings stay empty, nobody up there even looks curious. Stopping a vessel at sea runs through a fixed sequence. Hail her repeatedly on alternating channels so the record shows she heard it. Then put warning rounds in the water where she can't miss seeing them, and only after both of those fail does anyone aim at the ship itself. It's the same escalation a state trooper runs through. Lights, siren, spike strip. Except this trooper is a helicopter, and the vehicle he's pulling over weighs 250,000 tons. The door gunner leans into the mount and stitches a burst across the water 500 yards off her bow. Geysers standing up in plain sight of anyone on that bridge. 50 caliber rounds, leaving the barrel at roughly 3,000 feet per second, each one weighing about what it takes to punch through sheet steel. Her course doesn't shift a single degree. That's when the water off Kharg starts throwing wakes, 4 of them, spreading wide out of the afternoon haze. Fast attack boats, the kind Iran mass produces on the assumption that plenty of them will get sunk. Roughly 50 feet of hull doing better than 45 knots, a light anti-ship missile on the rail, a rocket pod up front. 8 days earlier, American strikes had put more than 60 of these boats on the bottom in a single morning, along with the coastal radar network that used to guide them. The coxswain running point that day happened to be somewhere else. He knows exactly what the odds look like, and he's coming anyway. Spray 40 feet off his stern, running a bearing that keeps the tanker between his hull and the helicopter's gun. He understands the geometry of cover as well as the Americans flying against him. One boat alone is a nuisance. 4 of them fanning out is a targeting problem, and Iran built it on purpose. A door gun only points one way at a time, and every second spent engaging one boat gives the other 3 a free run at an unguarded bearing. At this speed, from 6 miles out, they own this stretch of water inside 8 minutes. The gun can reach them, technically, but lining up a shot means swinging the aircraft out into open air. And open air is exactly the problem right now, because the only real cover on this ocean is the tanker itself. From bow to signal mast, Belma stands 160 feet tall. Draw a line from the coastal radar on Kharg across the top of her superstructure, and everything below that line on the far side sits in a radar shadow the beam physically cannot reach. A gap in the picture the exact size of a helicopter creeping along at 5.5 knots. A supertanker's hull also throws back a radar echo 1,000 times stronger than a helicopter's, so even a partial overlap effectively drowns the Seahawk inside the tanker's own reflected energy. As she moves, that shadow drifts north with her, and the helicopter flies a matching track to stay tucked inside it. For this stretch of the fight, the very ship they're hunting is the one thing dictating where the Americans are allowed to fly. That works fine, right up until somebody needs a clean line of sight. Back on Kharg, that same air defense battery, the one that's outlasted 90 strikes by never keying its radar for more than a few seconds at a stretch, picks up a bearing and starts earning its keep. They relocate between hardened positions every few hours and transmit in bursts too brief to get a fix on, and they haven't gotten careless yet. A launch truck rolls into position, stabilizers slam down, 4 missile canisters swing up to firing angle. The flat radar panel mounted on its back is the best system Iran fields. 90 miles of detection range against a fighter-sized target. Precision tracking out to 75, capable of guiding 6 interceptors simultaneously. No spinning dish, nothing mechanical at all. Thousands of tiny transmitters steering the beam electronically, the same way a stadium screen redraws an image without a single bulb physically moving. And against a helicopter sitting at 50 feet, none of those impressive numbers matter. The same curvature of the Earth that's kept this Seahawk alive all afternoon draws a hard limit around that truck too, with the radar mounted roughly 20 feet up. A clean track on a target flying at 50 doesn't even begin until 14 miles out. The battery commander knows that circle down to the meter. What he's missing isn't better radar. What he needs is for the American pilot to climb, even once, even for a few seconds. And the tanker is doing exactly that work for him, dragging this fight steadily north, shrinking the safe water under the Seahawk with every mile she covers. 7 miles short of the territorial line, the crew chief needs a firing angle on the lead attack boat, and the pilot gives it to him. No swing turn, just a straight rise above the tanker's deck line to clear her superstructure. Before the horizon even finishes settling in the windscreen, 50 rounds tear into the lead boat's engine covers. Her stern blows open and she peels off hard left, trailing smoke out of the fight. 3 seconds of exposure is all the battery commander on Kharg has been waiting 8 days for, and he doesn't waste it. Track locks, fire control commits, and a canister lid blasts off the back of the truck. The interceptor launching now weighs roughly 2,000 pounds of solid fuel and flies close to 5 times the speed of sound, a mile covered every second. Its warhead never has to physically touch the helicopter. 350 pounds of fragmentation only needs to detonate close enough, and the blast does the rest. Effective range around 70 miles, comparable to the distance across a mid-sized American state. Cost is north of $1 million, and Iran doesn't have an unlimited supply left. 20 seconds out, the pilot noses down and dives for the tanker's shadow. 15 seconds, Belma's stern fills the windscreen, close enough to make out individual weld seams. 10 seconds, 5, the missile screams past the tanker's superstructure and detonates 700 feet above open water, half a mile off the starboard side. A white flash lights the door glass with no shockwave at all behind it. $1 million spent clearing seabirds off the Persian Gulf. That miss wasn't luck, it was physics catching up to the missile's own guidance logic. A weapon moving that fast, steered toward where the target currently sits, arrives at wherever the target used to be. The tracking radar computes an intercept point ahead of the helicopter and uplinks steering corrections roughly twice a second, all the way to impact. The instant the Seahawk dropped behind the tanker's radar shadow, that feed went dark, the intercept point froze in place, and the missile flew, precisely and obediently, toward a prediction that had already stopped being true. At that closing speed, even a fraction of a second of stale tracking data pushes the actual miss distance out by hundreds of yards. Everyone on Kharg did everything the physics of the situation allowed them to do. The math simply belonged to the Americans that time. It usually does. And the bearing that nearly killed this crew never came off a radar screen at all. Trace it backward. The tracking radar couldn't see a helicopter at 50 feet, hadn't been able to all afternoon. The coastal network held the Seahawk inside a box 17 miles wide and couldn't narrow it further. What shrank that box down to an actual firing solution was a man standing on a rusted catwalk 6 miles back, a pair of binoculars, and a radio running off a $30 solar panel. Billions of dollars in Iranian sensor technology bought a general neighborhood. A thermos and a decent pair of eyes bought the exact address. It's the kind of imbalance that makes you wonder how much of modern war still comes down to somebody old-fashioned enough to just watch and report, and whether all the expensive hardware in the world ever really closes that gap. On the truck, a second canister is already slewing into firing position, and everyone aboard the Seahawk knows the tanker shadow trick only works once before somebody adjusts for it. To the south, an American destroyer captain gets a request over the radio he'd clearly rather not have to grant, and the answer takes a beat to come back. Then it arrives as a change in the air itself. 60 miles south, the destroyer's phased array radar snaps to full power, and an interceptor spins up inside its launch cell. 4 flat octagonal panels built into her superstructure, several megawatts of radiated power, capable of holding more than 100 tracks simultaneously, and every watt of that capability was already committed elsewhere, because Iran's Revolutionary Guard has spent the entire day firing ballistic missiles at American bases scattered across the Gulf. A radar running at full power stops being a sensor and becomes a target itself, and Iran's coastal cruise missile batteries need a firing bearing within about 4 minutes of picking one up. Somebody still has to hold the light steady in that room though, and this particular destroyer happens to carry nearly 100 missile tubes to back the decision up. 6 minutes is the entire loan she's willing to extend. 1 shot, 3 attack boats still closing, and the surest way to waste all of it is firing before the tanker's own exhaust is drifting the right direction. The mission commander's eyes settle on the band of unpainted red hull plating running the length of the tanker at the waterline, and that's where the targeting argument ends. Fully loaded, a ship this size sits about 70 feet deep in the water. Today, her cargo tanks are empty, so she's riding high, roughly 40 feet of hull standing clear above the surface, and those empty tanks are flooded with inert gas, cooled engine exhaust scrubbed down below 5% oxygen. No crude to spill, and nothing down there with enough oxygen content to ignite. A warhead into a cargo tank punches a hole and accomplishes essentially nothing. This is where an earlier engagement, weeks before, had already forced a change in doctrine. The obvious aim point, the engine room, is required by international maritime rules to be staffed around the clock. An engineer, an oiler, and an electrician standing watch every hour at sea. After a prior strike put a missile into a compartment exactly like that, the targeting doctrine shifted permanently off the machinery spaces and onto the funnel. a 10-foot steel structure sitting 130 feet above the waterline, the one part of the ship that's reliably empty and, not coincidentally, the hardest part to actually hit. 5 miles from the line now, the Seahawk slides out to the tanker's upwind beam and holds there, because there's no shortcut through what happens next. A targeting sensor under the nose swings onto the funnel and locks on. From 3 miles out, the missile needs about 11 seconds of flight time, and for every one of those seconds, the aircraft has to sit in open air, steady, holding that laser mark without deviation. You cannot fire and immediately dive for cover. The entire plan for those 11 seconds is simply to hold still and accept the exposure. Behind them, the tracking radar on Kharg flares back to life, needing its own 11 seconds to settle a fresh lock. 2 attack boats are inside 2 miles now. The destroyer's loaned window is down to 90 seconds. Every clock in this engagement is suddenly running on the same 11-second countdown, and 2 aviators have to hold a targeting mark rock steady straight through all of it. The first missile leaves the rail. The targeting sensor stays locked rigid even as the airframe shudders under it, projecting a coded pulse of infrared light invisible to the human eye, flickering 10 to 20 times a second in a specific rhythm. The seeker riding that beam down isn't hunting a ship or a funnel or a heat source. It's chasing one exact blinking pattern painted onto a stretch of steel, and anything that doesn't blink in precisely that rhythm gets ignored entirely. The weapon itself is a laser-guided Hellfire, roughly 100 pounds of missile wrapped around a 20-pound warhead, past the speed of sound before the smoke clears the launch tube, with a range of about 5 miles. In 11 seconds, it covers a distance close to crossing a sizable city park. Fired from just above the wave tops at a target far above it, the missile climbs first, then noses over into a shallow dive of 20 to 30 degrees, just flat enough to punch into the side of the funnel rather than sail over the top of it. And Belma starts working against the shot without meaning to. The haze drifting off her funnel is diesel soot, particles 1/10 of a micron to a full micron across, precisely the size that scatters this wavelength of laser light hardest. 30 feet of thick plume can cut the returning signal down to a fraction of its strength, and a missile that loses that signal coasts blind. It's exactly why the crew crossed to the upwind side before firing anything. A 15-knot breeze streams the exhaust plume off the far side of the stack, leaving the near windward face clean and sending the smoke somewhere the seeker never has to look through it. The wind is working for the Americans this particular afternoon. The second Hellfire leaves the rail 3 seconds behind the first. A seeker can lose its mark in the final instant. A first impact throws off a bloom that can blind the missile trailing it, and a single warhead can shred half a target while leaving the rest intact. Marking the same spot twice pushes the odds of a complete kill above 99%. The pair costs roughly $300,000 combined, against cargo waiting at Kharg valued around $140 million. Somewhere in a Navy budget office, that's the cheapest traffic jam ever created in the Persian Gulf. 8 seconds left. A crosswind, a 10-foot steel target, and a moving wall of ship between the helicopter and the shore. The surviving lead attack boat closes inside a mile, and the crew chief swings the door gun onto it without waiting for an order. Unguided rockets flash twice off the tanker's starboard quarter, fired from a pitching 50-foot hull doing 40 knots through chop. The best weapon a small boat crew has left being essentially a prayer with a rocket motor attached. Something cracks past the rotor arc and punches through the airframe before anyone even registers it, and the pilot holds position exactly where he sits. Moving now means throwing away 2 missiles already committed and starting the entire engagement over from nothing. 4 seconds. The first Hellfire buries itself into the side of Belma's funnel. The casing blooms outward, and the second missile, flying through the drifting smoke of the first, tears into the untouched half of the breach. 12 decks below on the bridge, the deck shudders once, and the engine note simply cuts out. The Seahawk drops back into the tanker's radar shadow, and on Kharg, a freshly loaded interceptor sits trapped on its rail with nothing left worth shooting at. The most expensive paperweight in the Gulf, aimed at an empty patch of sky. Look inside that torn funnel casing, and the reasoning behind the whole strike becomes obvious. That steel trunking running down through the ship isn't decoration, it's the engine's windpipe. The exhaust uptakes from the main diesel plant climb straight through it, and a warhead detonating inside shreds the trunking along with every line packed around it. Fuel feeds, control runs, all of it. A two-stroke marine diesel that can't exhaust its cylinders simply can't run. The hull stays intact, nothing below the weather deck ever ignites, and not a single crew member was within 10 decks of the impact point. Propulsion just stops. It leaves you turning over the same question long after the story ends. Whether stopping a ship this way, engine dead but every sailor aboard untouched, counts as restraint or just a more efficient kind of force. A ship the size of several football fields brought to a complete standstill without a single life lost on either side feels almost like mercy dressed up as firepower. Whether that's a system working exactly as intended or a war finding a quieter way to keep going is the kind of thing reasonable people are going to see very differently.